Hello, I'm teacher Karina, and I'm here to share some information with you about Sherlock Holmes. Author Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 60 mystery stories featuring the wildly popular detective character Sherlock Holmes and his loyal assistant Watson.
The inspiration for Holmes and his deductive powers was Professor Joseph Bell of Edinburgh University, under whom the young Conan Doyle studied medicine.
And I used, as a student, to have an old professor. His name was Bell, who was extraordinarily quick at deductive work. He would look at the patient. He would hardly allow the patient to open his mouth, but he would make his diagnosis of the disease and also very often of the patient's nationality and occupation and other points entirely by his power of observation. So naturally I thought to myself, well, if a scientific man like Bell was to come into the detective business, he wouldn't do these things by chance. He'd get the thing by building it up scientifically.
The classic Strand magazine illustrations, this was Holmes in disguise in The Final Problem, came about by chance. Conan Doyle chose Walter Paget to be the illustrator of his stories, but his brother, Sidney Paget, opened the letter by mistake. Sidney not only took the commission, but went on to use his brother's rather aquiline features as the model for Sherlock Holmes. By the standards of the 1880s, Holmesian deduction was formidable, but it was allied to science. Not only did the detective clearly have a sense of right and wrong, but his inquiring mind and outstanding analytic ability was based on the new discipline of forensics. His crime scene analysis was exemplary.
Well, actually, I think that Sherlock Holmes's approach to crime scene investigation in particular was amazingly good. Those first few minutes at a scene of crime are absolutely crucial. In fact, they're probably the time when the scientist works hardest. And I think Watson once described Holmes as lounging up and down on the pavement, I think it was studying Scarlet, outside the scene of the crime, nowhere near the actual room where the murder had taken place. And what he was doing was just looking for all these clues, trying to assess what had happened, the sequence of events, where the areas were where the clues were likely to be, and what sort of clues they were, sort of how to go about getting the best evidence out of this. A very, very important time in the life of the investigation of a case.
Holmes remarked to Watson, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data." Such had been the success of the first story, A Study in Scarlet, that a second followed in 1890. The Sign of Four contained elements that were to recur in later stories. When intellectual stimulation was absent, Holmes sought the chemical alternatives. Watson recorded that Holmes's sinewy forearm and wrist was dotted and scarred with innumerable puncture marks. He alternated between morphine and cocaine, which he always took in a 7% solution. Holmes himself believed that although its influence was physically bad, cocaine was transcendingly stimulating and clarifying to the mind. At the time, such drugs were legally available and regularly taken by many of the so-called aesthetes, including the poet Coleridge and even Queen Victoria herself. But in the 1890s, it was not realized that addiction could be dangerous.
Holmes was at least partly addicted to cocaine, and he was also a very heavy smoker. You have to remember that cocaine was legal at that time, so these are on a par. And one reason undoubtedly was to seek excitement. Holmes's mind stagnated without excitement, and drugs were one way he sought it.
Despite, or possibly because of Holmes's heightened senses, the boat chase on the River Thames, which concluded The Sign of Four, resulted in yet another triumph of good over evil. As the police news showed, official attitudes were based on class prejudice. The appropriately named detectives still believed the myth that crime was committed only by the lower orders, not by the gentry.
What is interesting about Holmes is Holmes and Conan Doyle through Holmes, he completely dispels this myth. He actually shows that crime is not a pathological thing. Crime is a result of environment. It is a result of people's, individuals' personalities. And he transcends this idea that crime is merely the product of the dangerous classes, this wonderful Victorian idea of the people of the streets, the people of the underclass. Holmes shows us that the crimes, the great criminals, can just as easily exist in the drawing rooms and the salons of the West End of London as they do in the stews and the alleyways of the East End. And I think for this reason, among many others, he is well ahead of his time, again showing how much more ahead of his time he was than any other writer and any other detective of his period.
In 1893, Conan Doyle decided that he had had enough of his most famous creation. The Agent of Doom was to be his deadliest enemy, the Napoleon of crime, Professor Moriarty. After a chase across Europe, the final struggle took place in Switzerland, at the Reichenbach Falls. Watson was left in no doubt about Holmes's untimely death. It was a shattering blow, not only to him, but also to millions of the great detective's admirers. After the case of the final problem, no new Holmes stories appeared in the Strand. He was presumed dead. The truth was that Holmes was Conan Doyle's greatest creation. Much as the writer might have his mind on other literary matters, his commercial instincts did not desert him.
I've written a good deal more about him than I ever intended to do, but my hand has been rather forced by kind friends who continually wanted to know more. And so it is that this monstrous growth has come out of what was really a comparatively small seed.
Conan Doyle, I imagine, like all of us, wrote finally for money. He killed Holmes off because Holmes had become the monster he couldn't control. He was getting in his way. But interestingly, at the end of the Reichenbach Falls, the door is left open. There's no body. There's no proof he's dead. So a few years later, by which time people are desperate for new Sherlock Holmes and other people are prepared to pay a lot of money, he can reappear. Not rise from the dead, that would be silly, but just reappear.